What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, July 3rd edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Had a few days off, was dealing with some family stuff, but knock on wood, that is mostly taken care of now. So should be able to get back on a normal schedule. Appreciate everyone bearing with me and dealing with not having a show for the last week or so, but should be on a pretty regular schedule going forward. If anything changes, I will obviously let everyone know. But as always, going to walk through each of today's games, looking at the best hitters, pitchers, stacks, all of that. I'll recap everything at the end as well. We have 11 games today. Doesn't look like any major weather issues right now. Obviously, that could change. It's July. Storms kind of pop out of nowhere in a lot of places. But for right now, everything looks pretty good on the weather front. So I don't think we need to worry about that all too much right now. With it being an 11-game slate, most spots are going to be relatively low owned in terms of raw ownership. So you can generally just play pretty good lineups, but there will obviously be some spots that are still more popular than others. And we'll talk about that in each game as well. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. If you are interested in subscribing to the Endgame Syndicate, the link is in the description below. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the show. Now diving into it, starting with the Reds and the Yankees in New York. We had a 5-4 Yankee or Reds win yesterday. Luis Gil was very disappointing for people that rostered him, myself included. But today we get Carlos Rodon on the mound for the Yankees, Andrew Abbott going for the Reds. Very, very difficult spot for Andrew Abbott. We know this Yankees lineup is very, very good. Obviously, having to deal with Aaron Judge and Juan Soto individually is going to make the matchup difficult for any pitcher. And then the rest of this lineup, for the most part, is solid as well. So Abbott's not really getting any ownership here at 7,700. I don't really think that he should. Carlos Rodon, 8,100, projected for 20% ownership, showing up as optimal around 18% of the time for me. He is not the same pitcher that he has been in the past. He did show some signs of life starting a couple months ago. He started throwing his slider more. He cut back on his cut fastball usage, which was replacing a pitch in his cutter that was getting hit hard and not generating swings and misses with a pitch in his slider that does generate a lot of swings and misses, but it still hasn't really led to great results for him this season. Overall, a 22.9% K percentage, 4.35 xFIP, but he is still a decent option on this slate. We just don't have a ton of good top-end pitching. And then you do just have a pretty fair price tag at 8,100. The matchup against the Reds is pretty good as well, so that's helping him here. Cincinnati's active roster since the start of last season, middle of the pack in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching at 21.8%, 97 WRC plus. One big positive for Rodon is that he will be facing Elly De La Cruz from the right side. Elly De La Cruz always has a ton of upside. Obviously, he gives he's really fast. He gives you stolen base upside. He has a lot of power, but he is a much better hitter from the left side of the plate compared to the right side of the plate. So that is a bit of an upgrade for any left-handed pitcher facing them, which Rodon obviously is. But overall, it's mostly just Rodon's good enough for an $8,100 price tag in this spot compared to a lot of the other pitching on this slate. Offensively, I don't have a problem with either team here if you can get to them. The Yankees are obviously going to be the preference. They have the better hitters, but Cincinnati gives you negative correlation with a pretty popular Rodon as well. Neither team showing up a ton as far as stacks go, which is a little bit surprising to me in this park. But again, there's not a lot of great pitching on this slate, so I guess I understand it. Aaron Judge individually, obviously, you're going to be happy getting to him whenever you can. But I do think the Reds as a stack in your larger field tournaments are interesting because of the negative correlation. You see here that it looks like Steer is going a little bit under-owned, De La Cruz going a little bit under-owned. Candelario gives you some value with first base, third base eligibility at 4,200. But if that team goes off, you're just talking about a 15 to 20% owned pitcher in Rodon that is not going to be doing well. So I do think that in bigger field tournaments, basically the bigger the tournament you're playing, the more interest I would have in Cincinnati specifically here. For the Yankees, Abbott's not a bad pitcher, but you just have enough talent in this lineup that if you're getting to them, fine. But again, there are 22 offenses on this slate. Clearly, if you're getting to Juan Soto or Aaron Judge, those guys both are going to look pretty good individually. Next, we have the Astros taking on the Blue Jays in Toronto. 4.5, give or take, implied run total for both teams in this one. Yusei Kikuchi is going for Toronto. Renaud Blanco going for the Astros. Not a good strikeout matchup for either pitcher. The Blue Jays against right-handed pitching this season, striking out just 20.3% of the time. That ranks 21st in baseball. They have a 99 WRC plus. Since the start of last season, the Astros active roster has the lowest strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching at 17.1%. So tough matchup for both of these guys. Kikuchi is a good strikeout pitcher himself, 24.8% K percentage, 3.29 xFIP on the season. I think he makes some sense in large field tournaments as a pivot in the same price range to Carlos Rodon. Rodon at 8,100, Kikuchi at 8K. Kikuchi has better strikeout percentage this year. The matchup is certainly worse, but he is projected for about one quarter to 150 ownership of Rodon. So I think he makes some sense in that regard, but still not somebody I would be expecting to prioritize given the difficult matchup. Offensively, Houston showing up actually as the second most utilized stack right now. That's a little surprising to me just because of how good Kikuchi's been this year. 3.29 xFIP, as I mentioned, but you do have an Astros team that has a lot of power. Toronto is showing up a little bit further down the list. And also, if you look at the raw percentages here, you can see that once you get past these top few teams, most stacks kind of just look the same on tonight's slate, Toronto being one of them. So, like I said, a little bit surprised that Houston is showing up as much as they are right now. I don't know if that'll hold throughout the day. Since the start of last season, a 179 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters, 172 to lefties for Kikuchi. Pretty similar numbers this year, 167 expected ISO to lefties, 163 to righties. As always, if you are going to the Astros, don't shy away from getting Yordan Alvarez, even though it's lefty-lefty. There's not much ownership coming in here either, so wouldn't be surprised if they do end up being a team that I get to in tournaments just because they look better in my projections in this first run than ownership thinks they do, than the field thinks they do. So if everything were to look exactly the same at 7 p.m. as it does right now, I would think that I'm getting to the Astros as a tournament team. But again, Kikuchi is a good pitcher, so I'm a little surprised that the Astros just look as good as they do right now. And then also one negative working against Houston is that Kikuchi's not projected for much ownership, so you don't have that second factor like you are going to have in some other spots where, like the Reds, for example, against Rodon are going to get driven up a little bit, at least in my process, because of the ownership coming into Rodon. You're not going to have that factor going to the Astros going against Kikuchi, but you do have pretty reasonable pricing here. Bregman at 4,300, Diaz at 4,100. Obviously, Alvarez and Altuve are expensive, but they should be. Jake Myers has been hitting near the middle of the order at 3,300. Pena is cheap. So I think the value component is driving them a little bit as well, in addition to them just being one of those teams where when keeping in mind that implied run totals, not everything is equal. Like if you have a team with a 4.5 implied run total where everybody in that team has a ton of power, they have speed, they're all capable of hitting home runs, that team, when it does well, is going to give you a better DFS outcome than a team that also has a 4.5 implied run total, but has a bunch of guys that are just hitting singles and doubles, and they're just facing a really bad pitcher, so that run total is higher. When you think about what it looks like when a team does well, the Astros are certainly one of those teams that comes with a lot of fantasy points, more so than a lot of other teams. So in tournaments, they do make sense for that reason as well. On the Toronto side, they don't look quite as good as Houston does. Blanco so far this season holding righties to a 120 expected ISO with a 26% strikeout percentage. Lefties have done damage against him, 220 expected ISO, 20.5% strikeout percentage against lefties. There's really not much left-handed power in this Toronto lineup, though. Most of their best hitters are right-handed. Dalton Varsho individually looks pretty good as a left-handed bat at 3,800, but there's no shortage of good outfield plays. So the Astros do, I think, look a little bit better here, even though Kikuchi is a good pitcher. San Francisco taking on the Braves. Braves favored pretty heavily in this one with Chris Sale on the mound. Jordan Hicks going for San Francisco. $10,200 price tag for Sale on DraftKings. Projected for about 40% ownership. Showed up as optimal 24% of the time in my initial run. So this is a spot where he looks like he's going a little bit over-owned, but he's still one of the more likely pitchers to succeed. I would expect to be getting to a lot of him on this slate. It's not going to be difficult to save ownership with bats because there are so many offenses to choose from. Sale looks like one of the best pitchers. He is pitching really, really well this year. 32.3% K percentage is far and away the best on the slate. 2.44 xFIP, also far and away the best on the slate. Davis Daniel not included. 4.7% walk percentage, very good. 27.7% K minus BB percentage. To put that in context, excluding Daniel because of the limited sample, of every other pitcher pitching today, whether they're on this slate or not, whether they're on the 640 slate or the main slate, the next highest K minus BB percentage is 20.1%, shared by Ryan Pepio and Shota Imanaga. Sale coming in at 27.7%, just hands down the most talented pitcher today. Not a bad matchup against the Giants either. They do get out of San Francisco, so you're getting a park upgrade for them. But their active roster against left-handed pitching since the start of last season, 23.6% K percentage is the sixth highest in baseball. Now, you will probably get a lot of right-handed hitters in this lineup. The Giants do tend to platoon, but righties this year are striking out 32.3% of the time against Sale. So are lefties. 127 expected ISO, 267 expected WOBA. It's not like we have any real reason to be worried about splits for Sale. He looks really, really good. Hicks on the other side, not getting any ownership at 7,300. Not the best matchup against Atlanta. There is strikeout upside, 24.4% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Only a 94 WRC plus on their active roster this season as well. So there are some dangerous hitters. Obviously, no Acuna, but they have struggled overall so far this season. I think in your largest field tournaments, if you wanted to roll the dice on some Hicks at basically no ownership, that's fine. 20.9% K percentage, 4.05 xFIP overall this season. But overall, I wouldn't expect to get to too much Hicks here. The Braves and Giants, neither one are showing up much as far as stacks go. San Francisco sixth highest from the bottom right now. Atlanta slightly ahead of that. The case for San Francisco would simply be that they are getting a park upgrade playing in Atlanta, and they are facing an extremely popular pitcher in Sale. So it's just, if Sale happens to pitch poorly, which is going to happen occasionally, you're in a really, really good spot. You don't have to go any further back than yesterday to see how that can work. I know Yuta took down the large field $15 or $18, whatever it was, on DraftKings with a 5-man Texas stack against Dylan Cease. I am sure he did not think that Dylan Cease was going to get lit up. It's just that if he does, it was an advantageous hitting environment. And if he does get lit up, then you're not competing with very many teams at the top because, one, not many people stacked Texas, and two, a lot of people had Cease. Same kind of thing here. Nobody's going into this saying, oh, I think Chris Sale gets lit up today, so the Giants are really likely to succeed. It's just purely if the Giants do happen to get to Chris Sale, you don't have a lot of competition to take down the big money at the top. But obviously, it's pretty unlikely to happen. Atlanta on the other side, like I said, they have struggled this year. There is some favorable pricing. Matt Olson at 5,100 is just a cheaper price tag than you're typically going to get on him. Hicks has allowed a 152 expected ISO to lefties this year, so not a ton of power there. Righties have actually done a little bit more damage with a 181 expected ISO. Jared Kelenic, pretty cheap, gives you some stolen base upside. Murphy has some cheap power at catcher, but overall, not overly interested in either of the offenses here. Atlanta, I think, is more likely to succeed. They obviously have the better matchup against Hicks, but it's still not a great matchup. San Francisco gives you that very strong negative correlation with the field to consider in your largest field tournaments. Phillies are in Wrigley. Does not look like a Wrigley wind game based on the run total here. Slight wind blowing out to center, but nothing crazy. Zach Wheeler and Shota Imanaga, two of the more talented pitchers in baseball, or on the slate at least. Wheeler striking out 26.7% of hitters this year, 3.47 xFIP. Imanaga, 24.1% K percentage, 3.75 xFIP. We have seen him come back down to earth a bit recently. I think that was to be expected. This is somebody that had been outperforming his projections drastically throughout the early parts of the season. And when you get a pitcher coming over from a different league, there is always that chance that projections are just wrong and they're better than expected for whatever reason. But I think it was pretty likely that even, if he does end up being a good pitcher, a very good pitcher going forward, he wasn't going to maintain the same rate that he was at previously. So that, was to be expected. He's projected for about 9% ownership here at 8,700. He is showing up as optimal around 7% of the time for me. So I think the ownership is pretty much correct there. And the same goes for Wheeler, 19 to 20% ownership, 17% chance of being optimal. The matchup against the Cubs is a pretty good strikeout matchup. They're tied with Atlanta for the fifth highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 98 WRC plus. As I mentioned, Wheeler is certainly one of the best, most talented pitchers on the slate today. Happy to get to him where I can at 9,800. Imanaga does have talent. It is a tough matchup against the Phillies, but if you are looking to be different and still want a talented pitcher, Imanaga does make sense in that regard, but he is less likely to succeed than some of these other guys. I wouldn't expect to be getting to offenses too much here. You can see that, maybe hitters are going a little bit under-owned, but there's nothing that stands out as a priority to me. Sosa at 3,600 with MPE looks like an okay value play, but there's nothing that really stands out here. If you look at team stacks, Philadelphia, one of the many teams lumped in with a lot of other teams here. Chicago coming in further down the list, which is to be expected. They don't have the same sort of hitters that the Phillies do. We know that Zach Wheeler is a known commodity. Imanaga is probably good, but there is still more uncertainty there. So it makes sense why Philadelphia would look a little bit better than the Cubs. But overall, I don't think there's a lot to be said for the bats in this game. Now we go to a good hitter's park in Texas with the Padres taking on the Rangers. Texas, as I mentioned, won the slate yesterday. John Gray on the mound for Texas, Adam Mazur on the mound for San Diego. Neither pitcher looks very good here. Gray does, I guess, deserve a mention just because he is 6,500 for his overall talent level. That's a very, very cheap price tag. 21.4% K percentage, 3.92 xFIP this year. He's a better pitcher than 6,500, but the problem is the matchup here with San Diego. They have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year on their active roster at 16.9%. They have a 122 WRC plus on their active roster. It's just a really tough spot to want to get to Gray. Probably going a little bit under-owned because of that salary. 5% ownership showed up as optimal between 8 and 9% of the time for me. But again, a pretty low probability play. Just somebody that you can get to if you are playing large field tournaments and you do need a cheap pitcher at low ownership. Gray can be that for you here, but it's not a particularly high probability spot because of the tough strikeout matchup and the quality of the Padres lineup. I don't really have any interest in getting to Mazur against Texas either. I would rather go to Gray between the two. Offensively, you do see a little bit of ownership. Corey Seager, if he's in the lineup, he has missed a couple of games after getting hit on the wrist in the Baltimore series. I was shocked that nothing broke there. For anybody watching that game, very, very weird reaction from Seager. He got hit by the pitch. Normally, guys, stand around and talk to the trainers and pretend like they can stay in at least. Seager basically just beelined straight to the locker room. Did not even wait for the trainers to get on the field. So I was surprised that it wasn't broken, but it seems like they haven't put him on the injured list yet. So seems like it truly is a day-to-day thing. If he is in the lineup, he's going to look good here at 5,100. Obviously, there is the concern of he got hit on the wrist. Is he going to be full strength, or is he playing through an injury because 75% Corey Seager is still better than the alternative for Texas? There's no real way of knowing that. I don't think the Rangers are going to come out and say, yeah, we think Corey Seager is probably going to suck at hitting, but we're playing him anyway. So there is some added risk there, and there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. There's no real way to quantify that. In the case, like if you're hand building a lineup as a tiebreaker, maybe if you have Seager or another option that you think is very similar, maybe go with that other option just because, again, they probably don't have, they didn't just get hit on the wrist. But if Seager's in the lineup, he's going to look like a pretty good play in this spot, just, using the information that we have available to us. Other than that, there's not a ton of ownership coming into this game. Nathaniel Lowe at 3,600 looks fine. Pretty good value there coming off the 2-home run game yesterday. Adolis Garcia at 4,500 is pretty cheap. So there is some, relative to upside, there is some value here for Texas, and you can actually see them showing up third most often in all stack types, second most in 5-mans. But again, when you look at 5-mans outside of Milwaukee and Coors, all of these teams look, or a lot of these teams look pretty similar. But I do like the pricing on Texas, kind of like I was saying with Houston, where when Houston does well, it's a lot of home runs and some stolen bases and stuff like that. Same can be said for Texas. 4,500, when you think about what Adolis Garcia can do on a baseball field, it's just a pretty cheap price tag. Even 5,100 for Seager is very reasonable. Josh Smith, 4,200, good enough hitter for that salary. Semien, we know, has power and some stolen base upside. We know Lowe has some power. So Wyatt Langford certainly gives you stolen base upside in addition to power at 4K. So I do like the upside to salary, ratio for Texas. And I do think that's why they're showing up. No hitter, again, you can see here the no hitter is showing up more than 10% optimal, and that is Seager. But just as a team collectively, they are pretty easy to get to. They're going to fit in a lot of different builds. So I do like them for that reason. San Diego on the other side, I do like that they're in this park. I've mentioned it a bunch that Petco's been a great hitter's park so far this season. I still doubt that continues, at least to the extent that it has, so far. Texas is a good park for home runs. We know that San Diego has good hitters, has power in their lineup. John Gray is a pretty good pitcher, but he's not, elite by any stretch. Lefties this year do have a 203 expected ISO against them, so that stands out. Cronenworth, 4,600 at second base from the left side. Jackson Merrill, 4,200, we know has some power as well. Goes without saying, if you get to like Manny Machado, that's going to look fine. So I do prefer the Texas side, but I think getting to San Diego bats looks pretty good here as well. Before we get to Tampa Bay at Kansas City, catching up on chat, Luke said, are there any discount codes for Endgame Syndicate right now? No, there are not, unless you are a subscriber to my Dub Club or to Brick's Draft Caddy. If you are, reach out to us separately. We have promo codes for you. But other than that, no promo codes for Endgame. But if you are interested, you can sign up using the link in the description below. If you're not already aware, it's Utica, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself. It's more of a DFS, a higher level, intermediate level DFS training site than your typical, tout site giving you picks every day and all of that. There is some of that as well. Obviously, I'm still doing this show. We're around, in Discord to talk about whatever people want to talk about. My Dub Club stuff is actually available as well in the Discord. I have a link to my projections, my bets, all of that stuff. But the primary focus of the site is teaching you how to be better. Like, our goal is, if you wanted to not subscribe to any content sites, that you could play DFS well on your own through what we teach you how to do. If you do subscribe to content sites, which again, like I still do, we also are showing you ways that we use different things, different content sites to improve our performance. So that's our goal, is to basically teach a man how to fish, as opposed to just giving him plays every day. So sign up, check that out. We have a bunch of videos up already. Nerdy Tenor has a bunch of game theory videos up using toy games to explain, why things mathematically work the way that they do in DFS. Brick has videos up on how to build your own projections, how to build your own ownership projections. I have videos up on some things that I do in SaberSim that most people don't, that I think are really effective and make the product better. Yuta has talked about things that he looks for in baseball DFS that other people don't. Me and him actually just did a whole video together as well, where he walked through how he uses Fantasy Cruncher. I walked through how I use SaberSim. We used the same projection set and then compared, where we got to as far as similarities and differences. He talked about some things that he likes to do. So you basically got to see, our entire process in that. So we have a lot of videos up already, more to come, of course. So check out that link if you haven't already. Now, moving on to the next game, Tampa Bay taking on the Kansas City Royals in Kauffman Stadium. I mentioned it a lot, but good hitter spark, not good for home runs, good for overall offense, though. Michael Wacha going for Kansas City, Ryan Pepio going for the Rays. Neither pitcher is getting much ownership here. I don't really think that either one should. Wacha, 7K, decent enough pitcher, but again, not a great park to pitch in. Tampa Bay does give some strikeout upside here. 23.7% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 101 WRC plus. Kansas City, a much more difficult team to strike out, 19% K percentage, 99 WRC plus on their active roster. And it kind of sucks from a DFS standpoint, because that's the inverse, really, of what would be the most useful. Ryan Pepio has a 28.7% K percentage this year. That is the second highest on the slate behind Chris Sale, but he's got this really, really tough strikeout matchup against Kansas City. So it brings, his projection, your expectations down. On the other side, Wacha striking out 20.5% of hitters. Not the best strikeout pitcher, but he does get the better strikeout matchup. Wacha looks to be going a little bit under-owned to me, projected for 3 to 4% ownership at 7K. He showed up as optimal around 9% of the time. So I do think he's a value pitcher that you can get to in tournaments if you need it. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if that ownership does come up by lock. Generally, when I do this first run, if you get a gap like that, where I think a guy is like 10% to be optimal and the field's projected to be at like 3 or 4%, a lot of times by lock, they are closer to 10%. But either way, even if you were to come in at 10%, I think he's a perfectly fine value play if you need it. Pepio at 7,100 does give you strikeout upside, because of his talent level, but it is a very difficult strikeout matchup against Kansas City. We know that Tampa Bay doesn't typically have the longest leash on Pepio either. So, that's not ideal. Projected for around 6% ownership. He showed up as optimal around 6% of the time for me as well. In his most recent start, which was the 26th against Seattle, he did throw 88 pitches, through 74 in 3 1/3. The start before that, through 90 before that. So, if he's pitching well, you probably are getting around 90 pitches, give or take. So it's not like he's strictly limited or anything like that. If he were in a lot of matchups, I would really like the $7,100 price tag. In this matchup, it's more of just like, if I get some of that, that's fine. Offensively, KC is a team that I never mind getting to because of their stolen base upside, but I'm not getting too much right now. Tampa Bay is showing up quite a bit more. They do get the park upgrade going into Kansas City, so that's nice. They are facing the weaker of the two pitchers in Wacha. Not that he's bad, but he's just not as good as Pepio is. And you look at these prices, they're just very cheap as well, so that's driving them up. Most of Tampa Bay projected for like 5 to 10% ownership, mostly showing up in that same optimal range for me. Isaac Paredes at 4,400, Yandy Diaz at 4,100, Josh Lowe, 3,700, still very interesting to me. Obviously, there is a high opportunity cost in the outfield. Pretty much every team has good hitters in the outfield, but Josh Lowe does give you speed and power upside. He is still cheap. Brandon Lau, same thing at second base. 3,800 is just too cheap of a price tag for the talent level that Brandon Lau has. Again, not the best park for home runs, but Those two individually look pretty interesting to me. And then getting to, Paredes, Diaz, 4,200 for a Rosarena. Like these are just pretty cheap prices and makes Tampa Bay easy to stack either as a 5-man or as a mini stack, however you want to go about it. Waka has been good at limiting power this year. Only a 132 expected ISO to righties, 143 to lefties. So again, I don't think this is a great spot as far as the matchup goes, but I do think that the pricing on Tampa Bay is just a little bit soft, and it's going to allow you to make some pretty good lineups around them. Kansas City, if you're getting to Bobby Witt, Salvador Perez, Pasquantino, nothing wrong with any of that. They are obviously talented. I would like Kansas City more if Pepio's ownership were to come up, but right now with him at 6% owned, it's hard to really love Kansas City on, in the spot. If something were to happen and Pepio ends up getting like 15% ownership, I'd be pretty excited to get to Kansas City. He has given up some power to righties this year, 198 expected ISO compared to a 135 actual ISO. So he's run pretty good in that regard so far. Again, Bobby Witt Jr., Salvador Perez. If you can afford these guys, great. They're going to look like good one-offs. Very, very high upside, goes without saying. But they are expensive as well. I think Tampa Bay is the easier team to get to. Tigers are facing Minnesota in Minnesota tonight. Another game with very similar implied run totals, basically between 4 and 5 for both teams. Keita Montero is on the mound for Detroit. David Festa is going for Minnesota. And these are both guys that I should have had pulled up in Fangraphs before I got to this point because I don't know anything off the top of my head about either one. I know Festa debuted the other day when I was not exactly paying attention to baseball. So far this season at AAA, Montero has made 13 starts, 48 and a third innings pitched. He has a 24.1% strikeout percentage. He has also walked 13.5% of hitters. He projects for like a 20 to 22% strikeout percentage going forward in the major leagues, projects for around an 8 to 9% walk percentage. So at 4K flat, he looks good. Projected for 10 to 11% ownership, 15% chance of being optimal at that price tag. This is one reason I think why you didn't see more ownership coming into guys like Pepio at 7,100 or Waka at 7K. If you need to pay, or John Gray at 6,500, like if you need to pay down for pitching, a lot of times you're just going to go to Montero because DraftKings completely screwed up the pricing in these 4K. But do keep in mind that he's going to get some ownership because he's obviously underpriced at that salary, and he is still relatively likely to just not give you a particularly useful score. Like you can see here, I'm projected for 11.5 fantasy points. That's a good point per dollar play, but on an 11-game slate, there's a pretty good chance that if you roster a pitcher that scores 11 or 12 fantasy points, you're still really playing catch up to get to the top of standings because some pitcher somewhere, is going to score 25 points. Several pitchers are going to score 20 plus points. So just through sheer volume. So, that is something to keep in mind. It's why Sims can be so powerful. And it's why if you're using like a straight optimizer, you need to be careful. Sims can model a range of outcomes better, whereas an optimizer is just using straight point per dollar, essentially, projections. So good point per dollar play and does give you enough upside that I think he's a perfectly fine play in tournaments. Like you can see here, I think he's actually going a little bit under owned, but I would want to pay attention to that ownership number. It is nice though that he does look like somebody that actually can get strikeouts, even though he's clearly not likely to do it at the same rate he was in the minors. Below average strikeout matchup overall. Minnesota striking out 23rd highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 19.5%, 110 WRC plus. So certainly underpriced at 4K from a talent standpoint, but does also have a pretty tough matchup against Minnesota. On the other side, David Festa made I think it was his major league debut the other day against, I want to say Arizona, but I could just be completely making that one up. At AAA this year, 14 starts, 59 and 2/3 innings pitched, really good strikeout numbers with a 35.1% K percentage, walked 9.7% of hitters. Projection models coming in around 22% for him going forward, 22% strikeout percentage, around a 9 to 10% walk percentage. So another pitcher here that certainly has good strikeout stuff. He has the better matchup against Detroit. He is 6,700, so he's not overpriced from a talent standpoint, but when you compare him to Montero on the other side of this game, clearly not offering as much value. He projects like 1.5 points better, but you're paying like 1.6 or whatever times the salary. So you can see that's why the ownership just isn't going to be as high. But keep in mind just the way that scoring works in MLB DFS, you're pretty much always going to have cheap hitters that do well. So it's not like a sport like NBA where it's really difficult to like play any sort of similar lineup with Festa over Montero. In MLB DFS, you can do it pretty easily without sacrificing too much upside. So I do think he's interesting as a contrarian play in tournaments since he is only projected for about 5% ownership. The Tigers so far this season against right-handed pitching, striking out 23.4% of the time. That's tied for 10th highest with San Francisco, only a 91 WRC plus. So like I said, right now, I think both these pitchers are going a little bit under-owned. The way it looks right now, I would probably be playing a lot of Montero. But if by lock you were to see him getting, say, 15, 20% ownership and Festa still down here at 5%, then I would like trying to turn some of that into Festa, to John Gray. I think those guys are pretty similar as well. Offensively, there is a lot of volatility here since we have two pitchers with basically no major league experience. Minnesota showing up middle of the pack, as is Detroit as far as stacking goes. Minnesota looks a little bit more appealing. They do have the better offense. They are facing the more popular pitchers, so you do get that negative correlation. Their pricing is reasonable. Correa has gotten a bit more expensive, coming up to $4,900, but Castro with MPE at $4,500, probably leading off is nice. Buxton, not having the type of year that we've seen in the past, but still has that talent at $4,400. Austin Martin is cheap, probably into the bottom of the order, but does have MPE if you needed that as like a fifth piece in a stack. So I think Minnesota looks a little bit better because you do get a little bit more negative correlation. They are just, the better offense as well. But I don't mind getting into some Detroit either. They're cheap. They're facing a pitcher making a second major league start. There's just a lot of volatility that comes with that. And there's not a lot of ownership coming into this game. Correa, Buxton, Castro getting like 8 to 9%. But other than that, most of these guys are 5% or less. So I don't think there's a true priority there, but I do think there's a pretty obvious path to either of these offenses having a good game, just given that they're facing complete unknowns as far as pitching goes. Now we get Colorado and Milwaukee in Coors Field. Obviously the best offensive spot on the slate. Not a lot of good pitching in this one either. Colin Rea going for Milwaukee. Dakota Hudson pitching for Colorado. Reyes so far this season striking out just 16.8% of hitters with a 4.6 xFIP. Dakota Hudson striking out 12% of hitters with a 5.28 xFIP. You have two pitchers that don't miss a lot of bats, allow you to put the ball in play in Coors Field, a stadium that is going to drive up the batting average on balls in play. So really, really good spot for both teams. Milwaukee obviously has more talent. They far and away look like the best stack on tonight's slate. Keep in mind that, they're probably going to be the most popular as well, but they look really, really good here. And because there are so many games, the raw ownership numbers probably should still be, relatively reasonable. Colorado is a stat coming in further down the list. And you can see that here, 10 to 12% ownership projected for Yelich, Contreras, Turang, Adames, Hoskins, Bowers. No issues with any of that. It's not like it's a 6-game slate and you're getting 30% ownership to these guys, at least projected. I do know that we got Brendan Rodgers yesterday at like 25% on the other side of this game. But point being, they are going to be the most popular team, most likely, but the raw ownership numbers are a little bit easier to deal with than they would be if the slate were smaller. It's obviously a very, very, very good spot here. Hudson so far this season, only a 146 expected ISO allowed to righties, 175 to lefties. That is the only real negative, is that he hasn't given up a lot of power. He just doesn't get strikeouts. He walks too many guys. So he's allowing you to put the ball in play. He's putting guys on base. So you're getting more plate appearances. All of that stuff is good. I just wish he would give up more home runs. But if you can get him out of the game early, get into the front end of the Rockies bullpen, you have plenty of opportunity for adding on runs later as well. Colorado on the other side, not a bad matchup for them either. They certainly don't have as much talent as Milwaukee does. But Colin Rea has allowed a 215 expected ISO to lefties this year, 167 to righties. Ryan McMahon looks very good at 5,100. Certainly like getting there if I can. Blackman at 5K, Tovar at 5K, no issues with any of that. Nolan Jones theoretically has power from the left side. So does Tolia. So there is some left-handed power in this lineup, most likely, with Blackman, with Jones, with Tolia, with McMahon, that can get to Rea. You do have left-handed relievers that are solid in Milwaukee's bullpen, but I think Colorado looks okay. They're getting less ownership than Milwaukee is, and they should, but you're still getting, a team in Coors Field with one of the highest implied run totals on the slate. One other thing I will mention with Milwaukee is to pay attention to the lineup that they put out there. This is a team that is frequently going to offer or have a lot of pinch hit risk because they just have a lot of kind of interchangeable pieces. So do pay attention. Like for example, we have Dakota Hudson going for Colorado. If you have Jake Bauers starting today and Rhys Hoskins is not, there's a pretty good chance that Bowers is getting pitch hit for later if they bring a lefty in by Hoskins. You can also pay attention to the way that the lineup is constructed. Like, for example, if they have a lineup where Jake Bowers is hitting, it's like righty, righty, Jake Bowers, righty, righty, it's more difficult to match up with Jake Bowers and force the pinch hitter. Whereas if you have like Garrett Mitchell from the left side, Jake Bowers from the left side, Sal Frelick from the left side, all back to back to back, there's a really good chance of lefties coming in there and that like Hoskins is hitting for Bowers. If Jackson Chourio doesn't start, it increases the pinch hit risk for guys like Mitchell or Frelick in the outfield. So do pay attention to not only who is in the lineup for Milwaukee, but who is not. Because obviously, like if Bowers and Hoskins are in the lineup, that's good for Bowers. If Mitchell and Chourio are in the lineup, that's good for Mitchell, etc. So do pay attention to that with Milwaukee. I actually can pull up pretty quickly and double check to see what Colorado's bullpen looks like right now as far as being able to match up. Obviously another thing that doesn't get talked about a ton, but can be useful to look at. The Rockies have two lefties in their bullpen. Ty Block is one of them. He threw 39 pitches yesterday, so he's probably not pitching today. Jalen Beeks is the other. He threw 17 pitches yesterday. They generally use him as a setup man. So I do think it's going to be more difficult for Colorado to match up today in general than usual. It does probably lower pinch hit risk a little bit for those left-handed bats for Milwaukee, and it does just make Milwaukee look a little bit better overall because of that. Looking to the other side quickly, Hobie Milner threw 4 pitches yesterday, 21 the day before that. I don't know if they'll use him. Like, he threw 4 pitches, but he still warmed up and everything. Teams frequently don't want to use a guy 3 days in a row. Their other lefty, Rob Strinsky, he got that spot start yesterday ahead of, I think it was Wilson. He's pitched 2 days in a row also. So, and then their third lefty threw 36 pitches yesterday. So there is a chance that lefties in this game are actually really, really good because it looks like both bullpens have kind of blown through their matchup guys lately. So something to keep in mind, at the very least as a tiebreaker. Some stuff that would usually be a risk in this game is not really as much of a risk tonight when you look at who's available in these bullpens. So just the potential for add-on runs later in the game, I think, is a little bit higher, and there's a little bit lower pitch hit risk for these left-handed bats. Next, we have the Angels taking on the A's in Oakland, so a pretty substantial park downgrade for the Angels. Davis Daniel is on the mound for the Angels. Joey Estes going for Oakland. Daniel, 7,500, projected for about 15% ownership, 13% chance of being optimal. He cost me quite a bit of money the other day where he had the best start that he will probably ever have in his career by a wide margin, and I did not have him in my best lineups. But he still looks like a good option today, even keeping in mind that he will never, ever do what he did last start again. At AAA this year, where he spent most of his time, 14 starts, 76 innings pitched, so fully stretched out. We saw them have a long leash on him last start as well. Obviously, he was pitching really, really well. But a lot of times, even if a rookie, not super highly regarded pitcher gives you 6-7 innings where they're dominating, a lot of times you'll still see a team just be, okay, great, we're just going to go to the back end of the bullpen now. We're not going to let this guy go out there and implode. They let him keep going out there. They trusted him to keep going out there. So clearly this guy can work deep into games if he's pitching well, which you do like to see. He projects going forward in most models for like an 18 to 20% strikeout percentage, 4.5 to 4.8 FIP. So again, not a highly regarded prospect. He's like 27 years old. Doesn't project as a great pitcher, but he does have a good matchup here. He is in a good park. He is reasonably priced, so I do think that getting to him makes sense at 7,500. Oakland has the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Their WRC plus is down to 105 on their active roster. That is above average, obviously, but keep in mind that it's pretty inflated by that, month-long stretch where they were like the best hitting team in baseball or close to it. Overall, I think from a production standpoint, this is a pretty average offense, and then they strike out a lot. They do have power, but this park mitigates it. So Daniel makes a lot of sense to me at 7,500. Estes on the other side, good matchup for him too. 6K, projected for about 6% ownership, 9.5% chance of being optimal. I think he's going a little bit under-owned here. Not any sort of a priority, but just another cheap pitcher that you can get to at lower ownership than Montero. If Montero's ownership were to get steamed throughout the day at 4K. Again, with Montero's current ownership, I think in most lineups, I probably just play Montero and improve my hitting elsewhere. But Estes projects for around an 18 to 19% strikeout percentage, around a 4.6, 4.8 FIP. So pretty similar projection profile to Davis Daniel. who is $1,500 more expensive and 3 times as popular, give or take. But Daniel does have the better strikeout matchup. The Angels are not very good against right-handed pitching this year. They are much better against lefties, only a 93 WRC plus. They rank 13th in strikeout percentage, or tied for 12th with the White Sox in strikeout percentage. So I do think Estes in your larger field tournaments, if you need a lower owned value guy, is fine, but doesn't project quite as well as some of the alternatives. Dodgers facing Arizona tonight in Dodger Stadium. Good park for hitting. Gavin Stone pitching for the Dodgers. Christian Mena on the mound for Arizona. This is the most on-the-fly FanGraphs usage I think I've had to do on a show all season. Neither pitcher is projected for much ownership. Gavin Stone at 8,500 is just really, really tough to get to. Just a difficult salary, not the best strikeout spot or spot overall. 19.5% strikeout percentage this year, 4.02 xFIP. I'm a little surprised he's actually projected for 6% ownership here. I thought it would be lower than that at that price. The Diamondbacks ranked 20th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 103 WRC plus. Mena on the other side, 21 years old, making his major league debut. He spent most of his professional time in the White Sox system. This year, he is with Arizona. He's been at AAA for Arizona. 16 starts, 82 and 2/3 innings pitched. So clearly capable of working relatively deep into games. 24.4% strikeout percentage, 10.5% walk percentage. Projects for a 20 to 21% strikeout percentage in the majors. Projects for like a 4.1 to 4.4 FIP. So looks like a pretty decent arm. He is 4K. He is only projected for 3% ownership. He does have a brutal matchup with the Dodgers. You can see here, if you look at the optimal percentage, that I don't think there should be as big a gap between him and Montero. Montero showed up optimal around 15% of the time. Mena showing up around 10%. So I think Montero should be like 1.5 times as popular as Mena is. Right now, I just think they're both going a little bit under-owned, but that will be something to pay attention to. Like if that Montero ownership steams to like 20% and Mena ownership stays down here at 4 or 5%, then I become more interested in him, even though you do have the very, very tough matchup with the Dodgers. Obviously, Dodgers not at full strength helps a bit, but overall, not loving any pitching in this game. Dodgers are certainly a team that I would like to get to if I can afford them. They're showing up 5th most in all stacks, 6th most in 5-mans. The problem with the Dodgers is that, the guys you really want are very, very expensive. Clearly, getting to Ohtani is great. Getting to Will Smith is great. Teoscar at 5,400, Freeman at 5,800. Like, you're happy getting to those guys. It's just really, really difficult to do it. And then when you talk about the cheap, there's plenty of value in the Dodgers lineup, but one, they're not very good. And two, there's a lot of pinch hit risk with these guys as well, typically. So that is kind of a problem with full stacking the Dodgers that you want to pay attention to. But at the very least, using guys like Ohtani and Freeman or Ohtani and Smith as 2-mans makes a lot of sense. Looking quickly at Arizona's bullpen, they do only have one lefty in it, Joe Mantiply, who was the opener yesterday. He only threw 11 pitches. I assume he'll be available today, but he is their only lefty, at least as of this moment, in their bullpen. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, they can't do too much matching up. They can basically use him to get lefties out of the lineup once. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind. So there is going to be pinch hit risk with the value guys at the bottom of this order, like depending who's in there. Whatever lefties are in there at the bottom of the order, there is going to be some pinch hit risk. But there is only one lefty in the Diamondbacks bullpen, so that does limit it a little bit. Overall, again, if you can get to the Dodgers, great. Just pay attention to which ones you're getting to. But at the very least, getting to Ohtani goes without saying. He's going to look really good. Pair him with one or two other Dodgers and a cheaper stack. That obviously works. For Arizona, I don't anticipate getting a lot of them. You can see that pretty much across the board, they're showing up like 2 to 3% optimal for me. Ownership's in that range as well. So just not a lot of ownership coming into them in general. They do have some upside. Like, it's not that it isn't a talented lineup. It is. But the matchup's not great. Stone only allowing a 160 expected ISO to righties this year. Sub 100 the lefties. The guys that I would really want, Carroll and Marte, are not particularly cheap. I think the best case to be made for the Diamondbacks is that this is a good park for offense, and that outside of those 2 or 3 guys, Marte, Walker, and Carroll, they are pretty cheap with some talent throughout the rest of the lineup. Peterson, 4,700, I guess, is kind of expensive too. But like Alec Thomas gives you some upside. Suarez, at least in theory, based on what he's done previously in his career, gives you some upside. That would, I guess, be the case for the Diamondbacks. But on this slate, there's just enough other teams that are also pretty affordable and not getting a ton of ownership that I would probably get to before I get to the Diamondbacks. And then finally, we get the Orioles and the Mariners in Seattle. Got a pitcher's duel in this one yesterday, as we expected. Today, we have Logan Gilbert for Seattle. We have Dean Kramer for the Orioles. Kramer right now is projected for 20% ownership. I don't really get this one. I think Kramer is a perfectly fine play at 7,100. This is his first start back from the injured list. He did get hit pretty hard in a couple of different rehab starts in the minors, both at AAA and AA. I do have some concerns, one, about exactly how far Baltimore will push him into this game, but two, about like just his level of effectiveness right now, coming back from the injury and, based on what we saw in the minors. Now, if you knew he was fully healthy and there's no rust or anything, 23.7% K percentage, 4.04 xFIP in the best pitcher's park in baseball against the team with the highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. I think he's a good play. I understand why there's ownership here. I don't totally understand. The part that I don't totally understand is why he's getting 20% ownership when you sort here by salary. It's not going to work. Okay, so you just look at the other guys around them. Like, we know Daniel's getting 15%, Kramer's getting 20, Waka's getting 4, Pepio's getting 6, Festa's getting 6. I don't think he should be 4 plus times his own as any of those guys. So that's my only concern, just kind of looking at him right now. I think he's a good play at this price. He did make multiple rehab starts, so I'm not overly concerned about his workload. And it is obviously a great matchup in a great park, but I do think he's going a little bit over-owned when you have that many alternatives around him that are also competent pitchers. But it is a good part. It is a good spot for him overall. I don't mind getting him at all. Logan Gilbert, 9,400. Again, really, really good park for pitching. Much more difficult matchup for Gilbert, but he is a good pitcher. The Orioles they're one of those teams that's really tough to take pitchers against because they don't strike out a lot and they're really good at hitting. 19.5% K percentage is 24th in baseball against right-handed pitching this year. 122 WRC plus is tied with the Padres for the highest WRC plus on an active roster right now. So you do have a brutal matchup for Gilbert, but he is talented. He does have a 24% K percentage, 3.46 xFIP this season. 9,400 is a reasonable price tag. I think he's going a little bit over-owned, but does, again, just look like a pretty decent play when you consider that for the most part, we don't have a lot of stud pitching on this slate, and most of the good pitchers are in relatively difficult matchups. So, being in a tough spot isn't a disqualifier for Gilbert, but obviously he would just look a lot better if you were in this park facing basically any other team. So the pitching here does look, pretty interesting, I think. Offensively, it's tough to really love either offense in this park. There's so many games on this slate, and now you have a park where it's like impossible to hit home runs. It's really, really difficult to score runs, period. Now, Gunnar Henderson, anytime he's 2% owned, he's a good tournament play, obviously. Cal Raleigh, same thing. Like, he gives you more raw power than most catchers, and he's only 4,300, which is in part because of this park. So, like, hitting in unfavorable conditions is baked into Cal Raleigh's price tag. I think using guys like that in tournaments is perfectly fine because of their upside. Kramer has allowed a 286 expected ISO to lefties this year, 204 to righties. Like, there is power upside here for Seattle. Julio Rodriguez has been a very unlucky hitter so far this season. Luke Raley's got some power, but overall, it's just really difficult to justify prioritizing hitters in this park when you have Dodger Stadium, you have Coors Field, you have Kansas City, you have Texas, you have Atlanta, you have Toronto, you have Yankee Stadium. It's really tough to just be like, oh yeah, I think the big edge on this slate is playing a bunch of guys that are going to fly out to the warning track. So that's why I don't like Seattle more. I don't mind the spot. If this game were in Baltimore, I would actually really like the Mariners, but the park just really makes that big of a difference. You do get negative correlation with Kramer, which is nice, but overall, pretty tough to get to the offenses here. So to recap, Milwaukee, pretty clearly the top offense on the slate. They should also be the most popular, but it probably won't be too crazy because of it just there being so many options on the slate. Also, as I mentioned when we were on that game, Colorado is short on lefties in the bullpen. So there is typically pinch hit risk with Milwaukee. There's probably a little bit less today just because Colorado is going to most likely have difficulty matching up with their lefties and forcing them out of the lineup. The same can be said for Milwaukee's lefties. So that was an overarching point from that game, is that I think the add-on potential later in that game is just a little bit higher than it normally is, and there's a little bit lower pinch hit risk in that game than there typically would be. Houston, I was a little surprised how much they're showing up right now against Kikuchi, but I do think that their pricing is pretty nice. I really like the pricing on Texas in that ballpark against an unproven pitcher. There's a lot of upside to be had at pretty cheap price tags there. Tampa Bay is pretty cheap. Dodgers, obviously the guys that you really want are very expensive, but if you can fit them in, great. So those teams, stand out as I think, top stacks. But again, a lot of stacks look very, very similar today. Negative correlation with pitching, I think, can play a little bit bigger role than it normally would on an 11-game slate when you think about that as well. Pitching, Chris Sale looks like the number one guy. Carlos Rodon, Zach Wheeler as mid-range options look pretty good. Same goes for Davis Daniel. Logan Gilbert's fine. Dean Kramer at 7,100 is fine. Montero looks like the best, point per dollar value at 4K. Just a complete mispricing for him, but it is a tough matchup against Minnesota. You do also have a pivot in Mana at 4K. You also have Minnesota's rookie, Festa, at 6,700 as a value pivot, along with some other guys like John Gray. So pretty wide open pitching slate, I think. Like Sale is clearly the priority if you can afford him. Zach Wheeler is a little bit cheaper. Doesn't look quite as good as Sale, but still looks very good. And then other than that, it's just kind of like a bunch of pitchers that have pretty clear red flags, whether it's their matchup, the park they're pitching in, the way they've pitched this year in the case of Carlos Rodon, some combination of all of that. So that, again, goes back to why I think that negative correlation is probably going to play a little bit bigger role for me on this slate than it generally would on an 11-gamer, because so many of the pitchers that are getting 10 to 20% ownership are really only getting it because they're not quite as bad as the alternatives, and it's not actually because they're good. So that makes it a little bit more interesting. But overall, it looks like a pretty fun tournament slate. I think there's a lot of different ways you can go. A lot of pitching looks similar. A lot of hitting looks similar. So that's all for this. If you are in my Dub Club Discord, I'll be around there throughout the day talking about the slate. If you're in the Endgame Discord, I'll be in there as well. If you haven't already signed up for Endgame, link in the description below. Thanks for checking out the show. Be back again tomorrow.